Now, of course, Mr. Gatt, representing another of the very major players in the North Sea here. It's hard to make a profit, we heard, on the Danish continental shelf. Fields are marginal, etc. You have one field under development, Solsort, which is, I think, very...
Hejre.
Sorry?
Hejre.
Hejre.
Heron.
Heron, whatever. Sorry. They're all... Many of the fields are marginal. You know exactly what the challenge is. Now, can you tell us, from your business point of view, what are the most important factors in creating a commercially sustainable field?
That's a nice broad question. But of course, the challenge will be to get circumstances where the money we can earn from the field are bigger than the cost of drilling, exploring, developing, paying taxes. So all in all, it's actually quite simple. We need to earn more than it costs.
Mm-hmm. But what are the main factors involved in that calculation?
There are many factors. Of course, first of all, we need to find the oil. And the oil needs to be of a significant size, so there's enough value to build the facility. The cost of building the facility should be brought to a level so it is still commercial. And of course, the taxes to be paid needs to be competitive.
Right. And what are the main problems at the moment? Where would you, if you were to write the strategy yourself, where would you put your pressure?
Well, of course, there's a long list, but I think that one of the most important things which also will be dealt with in the national strategy, that is that we need to have a system that is adaptable to changing circumstances. I think the notion of kind of black gold and oil companies being very wealthy, that's a misconception, especially for Denmark. Denmark is, the oil companies working in Denmark are kind of the smallholders of the oil industry.
Right.
You know, husmænd of the industry. And that means that we need to look at a lot of factors that all have to be efficient. We cannot just say, well, there's enough money so we can spend a lot of drilling the wells. No, we need to be efficient on all factors.
Mr. Coffey, if you were to write the strategy, which of these factors that of course they're all important, but which one is the most challenging in the environment that you're looking ahead into in the North Sea?
I think I can answer that perhaps best by analogy. I'm based in London. If you look at the challenges that are being faced in the UK and in the Netherlands, for example, in maturing basins with small fields, there is an example there of how these challenges can be dealt with. And clearly part of it is within the control of the company, but part of it is also within the control of government to set a fiscal environment that actually says, yes, we do want to see these resources developed and we will help you, we will work with you to get the development of those marginal resources.
But you've just heard the regulators. That's exactly what they're doing, isn't it?
I've not seen it yet, but I'm waiting.
Ms. Murphy, can you pinpoint one issue that you will prioritize through the new agency in the UK in order to help business make more money?
Well, it's worth saying that the OGA will be trying to help business to make more money, but also be trying to maximise the returns for the UK. I think probably one of the key things that we'll be trying to do through the OGA is to deliver regulatory predictability and certainty. So I think that means having a regulator who is much more involved throughout the process and can help to guide industry on decisions they're making from an early stage so there are no surprises later on.
Mm-hmm. Does that address the problem, Mr. Joffe?
I think you have positive aspects here. I mean, those are very sensible things to do. And if you look at Denmark in particular, where you've got the Danish Energy Agency that is already very intimately involved in license meetings, you start from a very good base, which is a regulator that does have a good understanding of the challenges that we're facing and how we're responding to them, which things are in our control, which are not. So I think those are all very positive things to do.
But at the same time, you say you haven't seen it yet. I'm not quite sure I understand.
Only in the sense that the work is commencing now, I think, to categorise and characterise these challenges and work out how best the Danish system should respond to them.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Gatt, are we looking at an environment where the incentives simply need to be larger, or is this an industry problem that you have to solve yourselves?
Well, it needs to be in cooperation with the authorities, and the incentives need to be targeted. It's not, we are not talking about something that could kind of change the overall tax system, but we need to have incentives for areas where we need to see development progressing.
And yes, Mr. Wardell, how is this addressed elsewhere? How does government and business work together in order to create a sustainable environment in a place like this where we've heard already new investors, new small players, new types of investments are needed? How does this all come together? How does one create a sustainable business?
Well, you know, I think we're hearing a lot of it here. We're hearing people are having a dialogue and opening up. And actually, I think, you know, there is an adjustment phase going on right now. We've heard that this is an industry that's currently in transition. And what we're seeing is, in events like this and through what's happening in the UK, adjustments to the regulatory regime to adjust to a new environment, to adjust to the new industry realities, and to focus the incentives where, you know, they really need to be more focused. So I think there is a response going on at the moment, but it's going to take a little bit of time to play its way through. And there may be a few false steps initially, but, you know, from what we're hearing, it's in everyone's interest to exploit the North Sea to, you know, its greatest degree possible and share the wealth between industry and government.
How's the American authorities, the regulators in the US, how are they addressing this issue?
Well, you know, I think they're taking a very similar kind of approach. They've perhaps historically been seen as a little bit more industry friendly in some extent, but then we've also heard that, of course, they ban exports of oil. So there are elements there which are still very much focused on the national interest as the government and the politicians see it, and differently from the way the industry sees it. Now, again, there's a transition, there's a dialogue, there's an openness to considering what the best way forward is. And, you know, I think that you have to have a constant dialogue. There's no one way that you can regulate the industry that works for all time. Things change and you have to adapt to it. So I think an openness and you know, a sense that things are not going to be this way forever, but need to be constantly under reconsideration is an important way to adopt an open-minded approach to the way things are moving.
Like Frank Zappa.
Exactly like Frank Zappa.
Yes. Ms. Murphy, this raises the question of what is your analysis, what is the analysis of the British authorities when it comes to the profitability, the ability of companies to make a sound business in the North Sea? Where is the main problem for businesses as you see it?
I think there's certainly an issue that we face as a mature basin that many of the larger plays have already been found and developed, and so it's much more a case of industry needing to work together. There may be smaller plays which are only commercial and economic if a company can have access to another company's infrastructure. So this brings us back to the need to work more collaboratively and the role of the OGA to facilitate that.
Which we've learned today is a sticky issue, this collaboration. How does Dong look at this issue? How will you further cooperation with all these new players that we've heard are on their way to the North Sea?
Yeah, well, we will welcome them very much. I think, first of all, I think it's a good angle we are taking here, that it's not only authority bashing, because in order to actually to make a sustainable business model, all parties need to work together and contribute. Also suppliers, so we shouldn't forget that authorities should help us, not making it complicated to move a drilling rig from one area to another. There's a lot of issues. New players coming in, yes, they should of course have access to the infrastructure.
You say of course.
Yes, of course.
That is a matter of course.
Yes.
Why then
the way
are
that
all the regulators pointing at this particular issue as a thorny, sticky one?
Well, because the history has shown for all these sectors that it can be a complicated issue, because all companies are, of course, trying to optimize their own specific position. And opening up your infrastructure for somebody else might remove some of your own upside opportunities. But we have good examples on the Danish sector that we are actually cooperating. We have a great cooperation with Maersk, taking actually a Norwegian field via the Harald field. We ourselves on the Siri platform have partners from satellite fields utilizing that platform. So this is possible, and I think Stephanie mentioned something which I also think is important, both in the infrastructure issues, but also when you are trying to work between different license groups. Please don't be over-zealous on the legal and contractual stuff. And that is some of the issues that, companies working together, that we tend to kind of make our own commercial position, optimize that, and forget about the totality. And I think that's part of what we will be forced to revisit in the future.
Yeah, I'm wondering now, is it actually in the interest of industry if the regulatory bodies become more involved in, let's just speak plainly here, forcing companies to cooperate more intensely?
One would like to think it's not required.
But
my experience in the UK is certainly that there are behaviours in the UK which are driven ultimately by a lack of alignment. And I think that's sort of what Søren was saying. There's a lack of alignment. What may be a very important thing for me to tie my small field back to a host may be very insignificant for that host, may even be a distraction. And that's the sort of thing we've seen in the UK. From my experience, I'm not seeing that in Denmark at the moment. The regulatory regime for that in Denmark is relatively new. The executive order only came out a couple of years ago, and there aren't that many of these sorts of fields. But that's the direction I see.
And Mr. Wardell, how does the future look? Will regulatory work and enforcement be necessary in order to maximize cooperation and thereby the profitability of these businesses?
Well, necessary, not necessarily, but I think it can be helpful, and I think we've seen examples where it can be helpful, and we've heard discussion of where it can be helpful. And I think setting the rules and setting a framework are the job of the regulators, but also I think increasingly being a facilitator, which we've heard a lot about. I think that's an element that maybe they haven't played. They've been more about setting the rules rather than actually helping the companies perhaps cooperate in areas where previously they wouldn't have. And I think that that's a role that's going to be increasingly important in an area where there is more marginal production, there are more marginal fields, and therefore you actually probably need that cooperation a little bit more than perhaps you did in the past, where it's not so much a question of someone defending their profit zone, but actually two companies coming together and making something which was previously unprofitable, reasonably profitable. So I think that's the difference for regulators in the future.
Mr. Geir Hansen, just one last question. 5 years from now, what is the main improvement that the new Danish national strategy for the North Sea has brought us?
I hope there's a lot of stuff, because this also
consists of just the main
targeted incentive on the tax.
Targeted incentives on tax.
Yeah, allowances for marginal fields, complicated fields, high pressure, high temperature.
So again, the government must pay.
Yeah, no, well, we share, because either you get zero or you get some.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, help them down.